In 2026, Denmark added another $2.2 billion to Ukraine's war machine. That is a single-year military package from a country of 6 million people, a country you could lose inside Greater Tokyo and never find again. By the fourth anniversary of the full-scale invasion, total Danish military aid had cleared 9.7 billion euros. That's not a small nation doing its bit. That's a small nation conducting economic warfare on Russia's behalf. And it is making the Kremlin genuinely furious. Let's put the number in perspective before we go anywhere else. That 9.7 billion euros isn't one package. It's layered. On top of the military figure sits another 1.1 billion euros in civilian contributions, reconstruction funding, energy security programs, anti-corruption work. The Danes didn't write a check and go back to eating smørrebrød. They built an entire institutional architecture around keeping Ukraine alive. The centerpiece is Denmark's National Ukraine Fund, 60.4 billion Danish kroner committed across 2023 to 2028. That's a 6-year military pipeline, not a one-off announcement designed to make a press conference look good. It means Ukraine can plan around Danish hardware, Danish ammunition, Danish training cycles. Certainty is its own weapon. And then in early 2026, Denmark topped it up again. Another 3.8 billion Danish kroner injected mid-year, bringing the 2026 military contribution alone to roughly 14 billion Danish kroner. In US dollar terms, that's approximately $2.2 billion from a country whose entire defense budget not long ago barely cleared $4 billion annually. The Danes have essentially decided that defending Ukraine is now a core national function, right up there with free healthcare and aggressively cycling in traffic. Here's the mechanism that most coverage completely misses. Denmark didn't just donate money, it engineered a self-replenishing funding loop. When Denmark transferred its F-16s to Ukraine, those aircraft didn't vanish from the ledger. Their retirement freed up procurement and maintenance budget that fed directly back into the Ukraine fund. The jets are gone from Danish hangars. The money they were costing is now paying for the next weapons package. That matters because it changes the political optics. Instead of Danish taxpayers perpetually writing checks into a void, the government structured the aid so that surplus military assets generate the next round of funding. It's a model that makes the support feel like asset management, not charity. And that framing is what keeps Danish public opinion solid enough to keep doing it. The actual hardware flowing through these packages has been relentless. Ammunition, artillery, drones, radars, communication equipment, mine clearance support, air defense-related materiel. Military aid solves today's problem. The transition program is Denmark solving the one after that. Launched in 2025 with 2.8 billion Danish krone allocated through 2028, this isn't battlefield support. It's the blueprint for what Ukraine becomes after the shooting stops, or at least slows. Energy security infrastructure, judicial and anti-corruption reform tied to EU accession requirements, reconstruction financing, the kind of institutional scaffolding that turns a battered wartime economy into something that can actually function inside the European Union. Denmark is one of the few donor countries operating simultaneously in both phases, active military support and long-term state building, without letting one erode the other. Mette Frederiksen's government made a deliberate decision not to wait for a ceasefire to begin reconstruction planning. The reasoning is strategically sound. If Ukraine has to rebuild from scratch once the war ends, it becomes a decade-long liability for the EU. If reconstruction begins in parallel with the fighting, Ukraine enters the post-war period with functioning institutions rather than a hollowed-out state that Russia can destabilize through corruption networks and energy leverage. The Danes have apparently read enough Cold War history to know what happens when you let that window close. This is where Denmark shifts from donor to enforcer. Russia runs what intelligence analysts call a shadow fleet. Hundreds of aging, often uninsured tankers that move sanctioned oil through international waters by disguising ownership structures, switching flags, and disabling transponders. The Baltic Sea and the Danish Straits, the narrow waterways connecting the Baltic to the North Sea, are the choke points this fleet depends on, and Denmark is the gatekeeper. In 2025, 292 voyages by EU-sanctioned designated tankers passed through Danish waters. 292. Danish authorities tracked them, logged them, and worked with Baltic partners to build the evidentiary record that supports expanded sanctions enforcement. That data didn't sit in a filing cabinet. It went into the NB8 coordination framework, the 8 Nordic Baltic states plus the UK, which is now one of the most active coalitions for maritime sanctions enforcement in European waters. The shadow fleet problem is genuinely difficult to crack legally because international shipping law was not designed for this level of deliberate evasion at scale. But Denmark's approach isn't trying to sink every tanker with a forged flag. It's building the diplomatic and intelligence infrastructure to make evasion progressively more expensive and more detectable over time. Every voyage that gets flagged, publicized, and tied to a specific ownership network narrows Russia's margins a little further. That's economic warfare conducted through bureaucratic precision, which is deeply, profoundly on brand for Scandinavia. Denmark sits at a geographic intersection that most maps undersell. Control the Danish Straits, and you control whether the Russian Baltic fleet, already badly degraded by Ukraine's maritime drone campaign, can reach the North Sea at all. Denmark has always known this. NATO is now acting on it. Denmark hit the 2% GDP defense spending target, which sounds unremarkable, until you remember that for most of the post-Cold War period, European allies treating NATO commitments as aspirational guidelines was practically a sport. Denmark actually got there, and it's not posturing. The spending maps onto real capability increases. Additional F-35 deliveries, expanded army readiness programs, new investments in counter-drone systems, and coastal surveillance that directly reinforce the Strait's strategic value. In February 2026, Danish naval and Coast Guard assets were operating in enhanced monitoring mode across Baltic approaches, coordinating with Estonian, Finnish, and German counterparts under the broader NATO maritime framework. The Russians haven't done anything overtly provocative in Danish territorial waters, but the infrastructure for responding if they did is considerably more robust than it was 3 years ago. That's deterrence working as intended. It's just hard to make it look exciting on a map, which is fine. The Danes were never going to make it exciting. They were going to make it work, file the paperwork correctly, and invoice Russia for the inconvenience. Pull back from the numbers for a second. There's a Ukrainian soldier, call her Olena because that name appears in nearly every unit's personnel roster from Kharkiv to Zaporizhzhia, who is right now operating Danish-supplied mine-clearing equipment somewhere along a contact line that the world stopped paying attention to 3 news cycles ago. She doesn't know the political history of the Ukraine Fund. She doesn't know what the Danish Folketing debated before approving the latest tranche. She knows the machine works. That's what sustained, structural, multi-year commitment produces. Not a headline, not a photo opportunity with a defense minister shaking hands over a symbolic delivery. A piece of equipment that is in the field, maintained, resupplied, still functioning in year 4 of a war that was supposed to be over in 10 days. Denmark made that bet in 2022, when most of Europe was still running cost-benefit analyses. 4 years later, Olena is still in the field. The machine is still running, and Russia still hasn't found a way to turn that off. Here's what makes Denmark specifically irritating to Moscow, as opposed to generically irritating. Denmark doesn't have an internal political fracture on Ukraine. There is no Danish equivalent of the Budapest-Brussels tension, no major coalition partner demanding negotiation over continued support, no populist right flank threatening to collapse the government over aid fatigue. The Danes are, by European standards, unusually unified on this. That means there's no lever for Russian influence operations to pull, no domestic pressure point to amplify, no figure to cultivate, fund quietly, or whisper to at a think tank conference in Vienna. Russia's standard playbook for eroding European support, find the fracture, widen it, wait, doesn't work on Denmark. The country's political culture is consensus heavy savvy enough that let's help Ukraine and make Russia pay for every barrel of oil it moves through our waters isn't a left-right argument. It's just the position. Russia's influence operation playbook requires a crack in the wall. Denmark hasn't given them one. That's not luck. It's a political culture that decided this wasn't a partisan question 4 years ago and hasn't revisited the decision since. Russia prepared for NATO's soft underbelly. Denmark is not the soft underbelly. Putin thought the West would tire. He built his entire 2024 strategy around waiting it out. He was right about Germany for a while. He was right about Hungary. He was not right about Denmark. And the difference between a country that flinches and a country that doesn't in a war this long is the whole game.